Callum. If you have the recording in progress, that's excellent for on your side. Local team, please start recording. Please go ahead and start the live stream, Callum.
Okay, webinar has been opened and I am starting the live stream. It takes about 3 seconds, and on the screen, it will tell you that we are live.
And I'm going to do the opening, so if you don't mind spotlighting me.
We will bring this banner down in just a minute, and then that will begin the session. We do not see the live stream signal on, Callum.
1 second.
So Rick, the minute this banner goes down, you start speaking, okay?
Okay.
Attendees are coming in, and we'll remove it in 30 seconds, Dave.
So if you don't mind spotlighting me, that would be great. Thanks.
Yep, I will as soon as the banner comes down, Rick.
Okay, thanks.
And we're also live once the banner. Good, Rick.
Okay, we are live. Welcome to the final day of 11 Days of Global Unity, September 21st, the UN International Day of Peace. Sorry, my voice is a little bit craggy today. My name is Rick Ulfik, and I am the founder of We the World at we.net. And I co-created the concept of 11 Days of Global Unity with my dear friend, Troy Lush. Thank you so much for joining us for the closing panel of our 11 Days of Global Unity Summit. Today, we'll hear from Audrey Kitagawa, a dear friend and a partner and supporter of We the World for decades. And we will be discussing the last of the 11 themes, peace. Our other 11 Days Summit panels also feature extraordinary visionary leaders, including Rian Eisler, Jonathan Granoff, Dot Maver, Alan Ware, and many, many others. To register for free and watch all the summit panels, as well as to connect with the speakers and partners, go to 11daysofglobalunity.org or go to we.net to take action with the 11 campaigns for change. Trends magazine with editor Robert Levine, and all the work of We the World, go to we.net. Before we start, I want to acknowledge Angel Fullerton, Jana Larson, Callum Cintron, and many others on our We team, without whom this 11 Days Summit and all of We the World's activities could not happen. Thank you, Angel, Jana, and Callum. Now, to moderate today's discussion and introduce today's panelist, I would like to bring in Jana Larson, who coordinates our economic justice campaign, as well as so many other things for We the World. Welcome to the broadcast, Jana Larson.
Thank you, Rick, and it's so good to see you here. You appeared for our first day and you're here for our last day, as you say, making bookend cameo appearances. Well, I have a brief bio to read about Ms. Kitagawa, and I'm sure that this is just it's a very small part of everything to know about Ms. Kitagawa, but here you go. Audrey Kitagawa is the president of the Light of Awareness International Spiritual Family, an ecumenical, non-denominational spiritual community. She is also the president and founder of the International Academy for Transcultural Cooperation, the former advisor to the Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children in Armed Conflict at the United Nations, the former vice president and current trustee of Council for the Parliament of the World's Religions, and a founding trustee of the New York City Peace Museum. Welcome, Ms. Kiragawa.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, Jana, Rick, and all of our viewers to this event held on this most auspicious day of September 21st, which is the International Day of Peace. And before I begin, I really wish to extend my deepest appreciation to We the World and its founder, Rick Ulfik, for his years of dedicated service as a drummer beating the constant drumbeat of the importance of seeing ourselves as belonging to a collective we, whose lives are all interconnected, and the imperative that we face our global challenges together. And I also acknowledge that while I mentioned the word drummer, Rick is also an accomplished pianist, musician, and composer. And he has a sparkling personality all these years, always warm and cheerful, smiling and cooperative. Everybody just loves him. And your cheerful disposition, Rick, and attitude have uplifted so many people over the years. And I'm very privileged to be on this program with you and Jana. So thank you so very much. And this year's theme for the International Day of Peace is End Racism, Build Peace. And it is a recognition that racism in all its forms, whether structural, institutional, or systemic, is pervasive and runs through all communities and all countries. And it seeps into the personal conduct of individuals and has the potential to create societal destabilization and chaos. And therefore, there is a recognition that the need to end racism is important if we want to have peace. And we have seen such great polarizations in countries and communities that have occurred as a result of racist and discriminatory attitudes and behaviors. So I'm very glad that this theme for this year's International Day of Peace is End Racism, Build Peace. I think there is a recognition that we cannot have true peace unless we divest ourselves of these discriminatory practices and attitudes that ultimately create such dehumanizing and marginalizing behaviors. And I also want, and Jana, please feel free to stop me at any time, but there's a lot that I have to cover about the important work of different venues and organizations that address this issue of racism specifically. And I'd like to begin with the G20 Interfaith Forum itself. And I want to acknowledge the important work that is being undertaken by the Anti-Racism Initiative of the G20 Interfaith Forum. So first of all, a little bit about the G20 Interfaith Forum. And it offers an annual platform where a network of religiously linked institutions and initiatives engage on global agendas primarily, and including the Sustainable Development Goals. And the annual G20 summits are a very crucial time and place where priority global issues are considered. And the G20 process itself has evolved since it was established with various platforms, ministerial meetings, engagement groups, et cetera, that really allow different sectors and communities and stakeholders to present ideas and recommendations to global leaders. And our goal is to contribute meaningful insight and recommendations that respond to and help shape the G20 and global policy agendas. So this may, be a very good contextual framework within which we can have our following conversation. So the G20 Interfaith Forum builds on the vital roles that religious institutions and beliefs play in world affairs, reflecting their rich diversity of institutions, ideas, and values. And these, of course, include interfaith and intercultural organizations, religious leaders, scholars, development and humanitarian entities, and business and civil society actors. Now on the Anti-Racism Initiative, which I chair in the G20 Interfaith Forum, this assumes explicit responsibility within the forum to work towards the eradication of racism as a standing item for both the G20 Interfaith Forum and the G20 Summit Leaders Agenda, and to work towards advancing the goal of racial equality and equity. And our mandate obliges us to bring faith and public policies together. And the exercise of that mandate demands a recognition that racism, far from an isolated issue, really does infect every aspect of human endeavor and planetary existence. So the G20 Interfaith Forums, or IF20 for short, Anti-Racism Initiative's mandate is to remain sensitive to the impact of racism as a cross-cutting issue for IF20 and G20 comprehensively, especially in the G20's pursuit of full compliance with the UN SDGs. So the initiative assumes explicit responsibility within the IF20 to work towards the eradication of racism and to work towards advancing the goal of racial equality and equity by every means available. So there's so much to be addressing with the United Nations Declaration on the elimination of all forms of racism and the many international legal instruments that have been developed at the level of the UN. And, these are quite numerous. So it is heartening to know that the leading guiding institution, such as the United Nations, a global institution, has paid strong attention to this issue of racism and made it a point to not only convene world conferences on racism, but also to create the international legal instruments that deal with this issue of racism. And of course, contiguous to that, in the broader context of peace for which the United Nations was created, you have the UN Resolution for Peace, which you are celebrating its important anniversary today, and was adopted unanimously with a culture of peace resolution passed by the UN General Assembly. So, it makes reference to the Constitution of UNESCO, as well as a very important foundational document of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the importance of the development of a culture of peace. So there are many international conventions that have been created, and I can go into more detail. However, I'll open the floor to have a conversation at this time, or I'll do whatever you wish, Jana, as the moderator directing this conversation, and I'll leave it to you now.
Thank you. Well, I believe that this would be a good time to bring Rick Ulfik, for his comments in response and his ideas. Go ahead, Rick.
Hello, and thank you. I actually would like to hear more about what you were talking about, and I have some other things that I want to bring up that have to do with kind of the current events that are taking place at the moment as well. But Audrey, I'd be very interested to hear some of the details and the plans to address racism in using the G20 Interfaith Forum. We have these 11 themes. Unity is the first one, and that is kind of where we have talked about ending racism. Just it's part of the concept, but of course it all fits together with peace and all of these themes in general. I'm just curious if you have a little bit more details, like how can partners participate in the Interfaith Forum and to do programs to help to end racism at the local level, let's say.
Thank you so much, Rick. Well, the Anti-Racism Initiative has been very dynamic, very active in addressing the many different manifestations of racism across different disciplines and groups. So like, for example, we began with the original racism, and this was towards the Indigenous people. That was our very first webinar that we've done. We try to do a webinar a month on some very salient issue as it impacts different groups that have experienced racism. We also did the Anti-Asian Hate Crimes webinar. At that webinar, we had President Biden's senior advisor on anti-Asian and Pacific Islander Indigenous Native Hawaiian peoples, and the community activists from California, an assembly person from California, Grace Meng, who was the co-sponsor of the Anti-Asian Hate Crime Bill, which President Biden signed into law shortly after he became president of the United States. So there was an immediate recognition by the highest level of this country's representative, the president's office, to address anti-Asian hate crimes. And if you'll recall, especially during the pandemic, there were many hate crimes against Asians because of the framing of how the pandemic that we were experiencing came from China. So in any event, I think it created a lot of difficulties for the Asian community, but that is one form of racist behavior that this administration has sought to address. We've also had a webinar on the deep sea mining issue in the Pacific as a form of neocolonialism, and how this kind of extractive industries not only can be ruinous to our environment, but also does not have the respect for the territorial place of the indigenous people in their own countries, and how their own fishing industries, for example, have been adversely affected, as well as their environment, by this kind of extractive mining. So this, the Pacific oceans, our oceans are really, and especially with climate change as well, are really quite endangered. And many of these extractive industries are not helping with the environment. But the fundamental issue here is whether or not these communities, indigenous communities, really take the larger share of the burden of these extractive industries that often desecrate their sacred grounds and their access to livelihood. So the range is quite broad. And we also had a webinar on anti-Semitism, on Islamophobia, and the latest one that we had was on the Hinduism and discriminatory experiences. So because we are the Interfaith Forum, we also like to see the intersectionality of communities of faith, as well as, the policy considerations that need to be taken into consideration. So we have the international legal instruments, like, for example, in 1963, we have the United Nations Declaration on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. And it really affirmed the necessity of speedily eliminating racial discrimination throughout the world in all its forms and manifestations, and securing understanding of and respect for human dignity and of all people. And, it was very convinced that any doctrine of superiority based on racial differentiation is scientifically false, morally condemnable, socially unjust and dangerous, and that there is no place, no justification for racial discrimination in theory and in practice anywhere. So that was a very strong stand that was taken in this declaration on the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. And the Anti-Racism Initiative itself does affirm its commitment to support all international legal instruments outlawing racism in all its forms. And it does support the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, among others. And it's very important that we do see now through our perspective and our eyes, the degradation of the Indigenous peoples, the First Nations people. So we do have programs that address this issue, because I see as an important role which the Anti-Racism Initiative plays is to create awareness and to have advocacy, to bring information and education to the general public so they can understand better what the role of racism has played in really creating marginalized peoples and societies, whole cultures. We have cultural genocide that has taken place in our long march of human history. So these are the kinds of things that we try to shine the light upon to bring people into greater awareness. And the Anti-Racism Initiative recognizes, and it does resist repudiation in all forms of racism and the expressions of racism. And, it takes a stand that people are never to be commodified or instrumentalized, but really cherished. And as people of faith, we do affirm the precious worth of every life as an obvious consequence of divine love and compassion. So I'm very appreciative of all of those organizations, whether it's leading guiding institutions such as the UN or the multitude of civil society organizations which celebrate the International Day of Peace, of which we, the world, has been very instrumental in civil society in galvanizing and mobilizing this international movement to fix our consciousness and our participation on peace and unity and the collective we, and all of the important themes around which this important day is built. And of course, we also have to acknowledge and thank those leaders, visionary leaders, who have recognized the importance of articulating peace, causing international global celebrations around peace as a way to heighten our collective consciousness to embrace the importance of peace. And again, I thank so much We the World for being such an instrumental player in helping to be a builder of the international fabric for peace. So thank you folks so much.
Thank you, Audrey. I wanted to comment on some of the things you mentioned, as you brought up mining and desecration of sacred lands. And I wanted to mention that you are actually making a connection between many of these 11 themes that came out of 11 Days of Global Unity, like environment, economic justice, interdependence, and all of these. And the other thing that you touched on a little bit, and I just want to highlight a little bit, is this idea of creating a cultural shift towards what we call we consciousness, which includes everyone of all ethnic and religious and national and all kinds of backgrounds. And of course, it's not just people. We consciousness extends to all of life on the planet as well. And it's, that seems like that's a fundamental part, making that shift, that cultural shift. Some people think of it as the creating a culture of peace. So I think that's another, almost like a synonym in a sense. We consciousness is more directly kind of stating that we are all part of this kind of collective experiment that we are engaged in. And to realize that, to understand our place in the collective we is, and to value the collective we and our place in it is such an important thing. I think that's a lot of what you've been saying, right, Audrey?
Rick and Audrey, I have a note that our other panelist is available now, Terry, and I wondered if we could bring her in now.
And just so you know, Terry has been coordinating the peace campaign of the 11 campaigns. I think she's been on the road, right, Terry?
Hello.
Nice to see you,
Nice
Terry.
to see you all.
I mean, just before we get to Terry, did you want to say anything further about making that cultural shift, Audrey, towards the we consciousness?
Yes, well, thank you so much, Rick. Just as the UNESCO Constitution said that since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed. And basically, the we consciousness addresses this point exactly. So it begins with an inner awareness, the inner consciousness, and the recognition that we are all in this together. So we must choose wisely whether or not we are going to, because no one's going to escape. So we will either all thrive in our togetherness, or we will not thrive in our polarizations and in our dissension. So this we consciousness speaks to a unitive consciousness that is very important. And the 11 days of global unity is also addressing the unitive consciousness that is expressed in the we. So, and it also speaks to an important principle of cooperation. So I have shared in the past about this very important quantum nuclear physicist, Dr. Hans-Peter Dor, who wrote the seminal Potsdam Manifesto. And he had said to me when he visited me here in New York, and when I also had breakfast with him in Berlin, and we had conversation together in Kazakhstan, that the word cooperation is really important, because in the unseen world, photons, botons, atoms, and etc., there is a recognition of the need to cooperate. So in the unmanifest world, so too in the manifest world, it is very important that we learn to cooperate and learn how to cooperate together to survive, to have the resiliency, which can only come through our cooperative efforts, and to recognize that in reality, and this is with a capital R, there is only one of us, and that is manifested in the seemingly separateness of individuation. And, that's really fashioned by the five senses and the five elements. But in reality, behind the form of the manifest appearances, it is really the unmanifest foundation by which we all find our existence. And that is in the reality of the one consciousness, the we together, cooperating together. So you make a very important point, Rick, and I fully support you in moving ahead with this development because it is a very important principle for all of us to get to know about and to mobilize behind and support. So thank you.
Thank you. So let's hear from Terry.
I'd like to introduce Terry.
Oh, good idea.
I'm sure that Terry's all about this, being that she's our peace campaign coordinator, where we talk about going from a me society to a we society. Terry Angel is a happiness coach. You can tell by her smile. Energy healer, best-selling author, spiritual teacher, and mentor, and a motivational speaker. Terry is the Peace Campaign Coordinator for We the World and the founder of a nonprofit organization called Angel Speakers Incorporated, which offers educational workshops and events centered around environmental awareness to include animals and nature, peace advocacy opportunities, and ancient wisdom teachings. Terry's movement, Peas for Peace, involves strengthening our awareness of the oneness of all, unifying mankind through compassion, peace, love, and joy. She was named She Who Blesses the Sacred Land during the Peace on Earth tour and embraces that title with loving grace. Welcome, Terry, and jump on into the conversation. We've been talking about world peace, of course, and ending racism in all of its manifestations and appearances. So take it away.
Hearing and so appreciative to you, Ms. Kitagawa, for the information that you brought forth today. And wow, I'm just blown away. I am so excited to be a part of We the World, but also to be a part of bringing in peace on earth. It is where my heart is. I have been on the road for 2 years now with a mission of bringing more awareness to peace and what can we do. And there is something all of us can do. I think we're beginning to really see that it's not going to happen on earth. That would be great, but it's going to take each one of us because it comes from what's inside, what's in our heart. And this is what I share. Search your heart. Ask the question, is there something in me that's holding back the energy of peace? And then clear whatever that is, because until we can do that, we're still going to see all the conflicts, all of the isms. And yes, my heart it just hurts when I hear about acts of racism and violence and conflict. So as I go about and travel around to these beautiful places in our country here in the United States, I hand out educational material. I meet with people. I talk with them. I ask those questions. What can we do working together to create a world that works for all of us, to create this peaceful environment that we say we want? So we have to ask ourselves, how much do we want it? And is there something that's stopping that flow of love coming from my heart? So this afternoon, I put together a beautiful panel to have a discussion. Panel are 2 women from the Peace Alliance. One of them is Nancy Merritt. Nancy works directly with the campaign to bring forth the Department of Peace Building in our government. And I'm becoming more and more involved with that as a big part of it. There's something all of us can do, and this is what Nancy and this whole campaign is about, is getting people involved at the grassroots level, contacting your representatives, letting them know you want this, saying, yes, I want peace. Yes, I would like to see this happen in a very big way. So each of us has a role to play. That's the we, Rick. That's the we, is getting everyone involved. because we have to, it takes a village to make a movement. And that's what this is all about, is each of us doing our part, leading as we can lead. And everybody's a leader. So don't sit back and wait for somebody to take action. It's up to each of us. And my panel discussion this afternoon is called Peace in Action. So what is that action? And that's what we all have to ask ourselves. And as I travel around for the last 2 years that I've been on the road, and I talk to people and say, what can you do? What would you like to see? Because we have to get that awareness out there. It starts with the awareness, and then it expands out. And then it's like a domino effect. You know, you talk to one person, they get excited. They're going to tell other people. They're going to talk about the depleting worldwide, where there's an effort to end racism and violence and conflict. And it's such a beautiful thought that we can make a difference. We do make a difference. And this has been taught for years, that whatever we're holding inside of our hearts, whatever our energy is, that goes out beyond us. It doesn't just stay inside. And when we ask, how can I make a difference? The first thing you can do is smile. The very first thing you can do is show somebody some warmth, show them some kindness. Those little acts of kindness, that makes a huge impact in someone's life. If somebody has never had somebody buy them a cup of coffee, or just sit and have a conversation and say, I see you. You're a human being. I just got a message that my internet is unstable, and I apologize if I get frozen. We call that being a frozen pea. And the P's for Peace is a group of anybody who wants to be involved in bringing in more peace in the world. So, Rick,
yes,
to be part of we, and I just.
Yes, occasionally you're frozen in time there, Terry, but your message is coming through loud and clear.
Good. On this panel discussion that we're having at 5 o'clock Eastern today, we have also Shannon Crossbear, who is the campaign coordinator at We the World for Interdependence. And Shannon also works so hard to bring awareness to the Indigenous population and what's going on there. And I'm hoping to really get a good report from her of what the efforts are. Karen Palmer will be there. Karen is the Women and Families campaign coordinator. Nancy Merritt, Diane Tate, who is also with the Peace Alliance. And it's just going to be a wonderful discussion. So I hope that you all will have the opportunity to come in and listen as these beautiful people who are all hold that energy of wanting and desiring a peaceful world, and speak about action we can do and what is being done and how we can support those actions.
Well, thank you, Terry. I wanted to bring up the question of what's happening now. This is like some possible discussion about what's going on in Ukraine right now. And I thought that maybe, Audrey, you know, I have some ideas about this. I want to get your comments about it and then kind of open it up to all of us for discussion. But so Audrey, what do you think about this dilemma? I would call it a dilemma regarding the war in Ukraine. We have on one hand the US and the EU and other countries giving weapons to Ukraine which is likely to prolong the war and cause even more deaths and injuries. However, if the US and the EU and the other countries didn't give weapons to Ukraine, then Russia would likely have gone much further with the brutality and cultural obliteration that they've been exercising with regard to Ukraine. As it is, Russia's invasion already caused over 10 million refugees to flee Ukraine. And Masha Gessen, the Russian journalist, reported recently that Russia has forcibly removed over 2 million Ukrainians to live in Russia. And many children were taken from Ukrainians and given to Russians for adoption. And unfortunately, the hopes for diplomacy are slim at this point. So, Audrey, what do you think about this dilemma? Give weapons, don't give weapons, or, and then I have some possible solutions going forward. But what do you think, Audrey?
Thank you so much, Rick. Of course, this is a highly complex and complicated issue. Anytime, you have policies, preemptive policies that speak to first aggression, and often the real reasons for those kinds of preemptive actions are not well understood within the context of the time. And sometimes it takes many years to pass by an analysis, retrospective analysis, to ascertain, not only the consequences of such preemptive policies, but whether or not they are an appropriate and effective use. Certainly, we can't say that they help to create peace, because obviously war is being, the state of peace is absent. So I think if you listen to President Biden's speech this morning at the United Nations, because the UN General Assembly is in session and the world leaders are giving their addresses to the UN. This morning was President Biden's turn at the podium. And he did talk about the US's perspective about the sovereignty of these independent countries, and whether or not, we have to act to preserve their sovereign state. So, this whole aspect with having independent and identifiable countries is not dissimilar from an individual having the sense of their own form and structure and self-identification, and then issues of self-preservation, self-interest, etc., follow suit. And so too in the individual realm, and within the country, within the context of country's own identity, issues of nationalism and self-preservation, etc., come into play. So these are very, very complex issues. Now, with respect to the policies of, providing arms, the Ukraine issue is highlighted certainly in our media. And of course, the fact that we have media is now ubiquitous. So we are actually seeing in real time the effects of conflict. But also there are conflicts going on in the world, in different parts of the world, that are not getting as much press, shall we say. But that doesn't mean that it does not cause, misery and destabilization, and always the civilians on the ground will be the ones to suffer. There was a time, we hope, that civilians were not to be considered collateral damage. Unfortunately, that most unfortunate term came into our vocabulary. But that seems to now be, they are like commodities in war, and to really strike fear in the hearts of the general populace. And even rape has been, ascertained to be a human rights violation. Resolution 1325 at the UN Security Council has made, these aggressions against women in aspects of war to be, a violation of human rights. So these kinds of heinous acts and activities that come about as a consequence of war really, in the tools and weapons of war, become very much concerning because of their brutality and the fact that it is the ultimate expression of the elimination of people. So this whole, that's why it's very important for us to constantly have that different conversation, the different mobilization about peace as a counterforce to war. So whether or not we give weapons to any particular country, I think this whole aspect of the military industrial complex, which President Eisenhower had warned us about all those years ago, is certainly something that we need to look at, because the arms industry definitely is an industry, and we have to look more carefully who is really benefiting from the profitability of war. And we must not be naive into thinking that there is not a profit element in this. So the issues are very, very complicated. So the framing that you gave, Rick, would also probably be more accurately answered in hindsight. So like, for example, when the Americans dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they took the position that it saved so many more lives because the war ended. So it was, an important act to undertake. However, you look at the consequences of that singular, I should say dual act on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and 77 plus years hence, we not only have one nuclear state, we have 9 nuclear states and more states who are scrambling to, join the club of death. So it has not gotten better, certainly not the nuclear issue. And of course, I'm having a webinar on Thursday on the, imperative of diplomacy on the nuclear weapons issue, and taking it into the context of true human security rather than illusory human security. So I think this war in Ukraine, and of course the reactors, the fact that the reactor is situated in southern Ukraine, missiles have come very close to the reactor. And of course, if, there is a strike on the reactor, then you're going to have lots of death, environmental pollution and degradation that will take, hundreds of years to overcome. So the nuclear weapons issue is of, a very important concern. So we will not be able to tease out the complexities of these issues with just Ukraine, but there's no question that the people have suffered. When I was in Rome this year and went to the Antonarium, which is a Franciscan university and has a monastery there. I mean, they housed Ukrainian families, refugees, to live in that monastery. So other countries also are trying to do what they can to assist, but the destabilization of people's lives and their culture, their communities, their relationships is a horrible price that we all pay for war. So all the more reason why we really need good research and analysis into the causative factors of any particular war and all wars in the totality of wars, and who benefits, who loses. And this kind of analysis is very important to place our finger on, and always remembering President Eisenhower's warning about the buildup of the military-industrial complex. And it is an industry.
Exactly. So I want to bring up a couple of ideas moving forward. Get your comments on this. Certainly, I totally agree that kind of assessing after the fact, the situation is so complex now in Ukraine. And thank you again for bringing up the other conflicts that are happening that don't get as much press. This is all, it's really important to know what's going on in Ethiopia and Congo. I mean, there are multiple conflict areas. But one thing that I thought of might be worth discussing briefly, the idea of reform of the UN Security Council to override a Security Council veto by a supermajority vote by the General Assembly. So the idea is, if you have a member of the permanent member of the Security Council, namely Russia, that is actually violating the UN Charter, there's no mechanism to deal with that. So the idea of reforming the United Nations to have a Security Council override by a majority or maybe a supermajority vote by the General Assembly. And then with that in place, theoretically at some point in the future, the idea of deploying an international peacekeeping force that could intercede in situations in which a member state violates the UN Charter, like we were just saying, like Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Ideally, such an international peacekeeping force would use the idea of the protective use of force. This is a concept that I learned from nonviolent communication, but it could be applied to this. The concept is to protect lives without judgment of the warring parties. So any thoughts about that, Audrey?
Well, you have, first of all, in the current context, I think, because you do have the 5 great powers that have the veto power at the UN Security Council level. I think with what we have now, and I know this conversation, discussion, suggestions about reforming the UN at the level of the Security Council has been ongoing for many, many years. When you have this select club of 5 having the veto power. And I think there's a lot of countries and member states that find that that is not an appropriate way to handle international affairs. So that is an ongoing conversation. And who knows when and if that reformation will ever take place. However, in the context of what we have now, I think it'd be very important to work with the P5 countries and have a convening to be able to address the conduct of any particular country, and in this case, one of the P5 countries, and open up the dialogic space and see what can be done. But I think that at that level of the real power brokers at the United Nations, we must be able to have that conversation, because the UN was actually created to prevent, world wars. Like after the Second World War, it was seriously put into place. And, and then you have these alliances like NATO that is also supposed to help bring stability and hopefully peace with its unified pledge to protect any of its members from, aggression. So as a consequence of Russia's incursion into Ukraine, you now have 2 additional NATO countries that have historically stayed out of NATO, but now are members. So, for every action, there is a consequence. And so now Russia is even more surrounded by NATO countries and had strong objection to Ukraine seeking to become a member of NATO. So, and of course, Ukraine has not yet been accepted as a member of NATO, but you do have these organizations that are representative of coalitions created to hopefully bring peace and security to the region. So this whole idea of a peacekeeping force, of course, United Nations has a peacekeeping force. That peacekeeping force was on the ground during the Rwanda genocide. But whether or not it was, given the authority to actually, do any kind of mobilization to prevent the genocide. So the efficaciousness of any kind of organization is always going to be reviewed, most times retroactively, because hindsight is always 2020. And, I think to the extent you have peacekeeping forces, to the extent you have departments of peace, of which there aren't many around the world, I think that we need to develop those more. But also whether or not in the unitive consciousness, we can understand the value of being able to see the collective humanity in a way that is understood, that no one acts in isolation, and that the action of one impacts the whole. And if we do not have the means and the wherewithal to be able to have those modalities to bring any person or member of the collective to task for any violations of these and the destabilization of the collective. I think this is a historic problem that we are constantly wrestling with. And in the context of any historical time period, we do the best we can with what we know on how to create and deploy and implement the mechanisms to bring about stability and peace as best we can. Whether or not those institutions and mechanisms are still relevant, effective over time is something that is always subject to review. But, solutions, I think, ultimately, as, Kelly was indicating, we cannot ultimately abdicate our individual responsibility to hold within ourselves that inner work that is required to have that peace of mind, peace of heart, and to live in the ways in the world. She was actually talking about daily practice of the individual, and that we have to be able to move from that place of demonstrating how we are being in the world and how we are moderating ourselves as individuals with that consciousness of peace, with the heart of compassion, with the heart of kindness. So as I began this conversation about how once we have this aspect of form and structure and individual identity, we have self-interest that takes over, and so too on a nation state level. So as the individual, so in the outer world, nation states as well as individuals each have the responsibility to do the best that we can to live the way and to implement the way, and may that way be the ways of peace in our thoughts, in our speech, and in our action. And that will come from the cultivation and the development of the individual to be loving, compassionate people.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Audrey. And Jana, do you have any comments yourself? And why don't we move to kind of share maybe some acknowledgements of folks, and then we'll finish up.
Okay, thank you. Well, this has been an amazing week, being in this role as host for the 11 days and getting to know all of these leaders in a more up close and personal way. First of all, I would like to say that back to the issue of racism, I work with the Poor People's Campaign, and I'm on the coordinating committee for my state, my part of the state, and I'm also on the National Coordinating Committee. And last night we started our text banking initiative to reach 5 million voters by November 8th, reaching out to those voters who aren't voting and to get them to vote. Rick, I just have to ask, are you okay?
Yeah, I'm fine. I'm just have to trying to clear my throat. That's
okay. I just want to make sure. And then yesterday I was chair of the our 10th day, where I was with Alan Ware and his panel guests and talking about Unfold Zero, no first use. And it was a very fascinating discussion. So my own personal thought is just as a person, when you have a leader who displays sociopathic tendencies, that person is beyond has no concept of other people having feelings, and other people having any kind of worth. And sadly, that person is in charge. And so the solution seems unreachable. And I think that there is a lot of fear. I think there's a lot of fear among people who do know what's going on. And there's certainly a lot of fear among people who are struggling to understand everything that's happening. Those are my thoughts. But then I would like to talk about the people that we met this week. And we started out with Theme of Unity with John Raymer from Compassion Games. And he represented Ben Bowler from Unity Earth. And together that was known as World Unity Week and 99 Days of Peace. And then the next day was Interdependence, where our special guest was David Wick with Pathways to Peace and Rotary International, and our own grandmother, Shannon Crossbear. And then we had Environment, where we met with Stacy Morgan and Lynn Trotta, two women in a community working with another person, a friend of Rick's, to save the Buttonhook Forest for its ecosystem and connection to Indigenous connection. And Sandra Proofer, who works with Dr. Barton Rubenstein, who lives in Washington, D.C., but he founded the Mother Earth Project, and he wasn't able to to participate in our event that day because he was invited to the White House to talk with President Biden about his work that his project has done for the environment. And then the next day was economic justice, my campaign. So I had people, my colleagues from the Poor People's Campaign and one of our campaign managers, Jack Strasberg, who has his conscious business. And then one of our team members in Uganda, who is a doctor working in the refugee camps for all the refugees fleeing from the Congo, another very desperate situation. Our fifth day was health, and we were joined by Catherine Davis, our Heart of Mind Radio, and she's our health campaign coordinator, and Kurt Kruger with his Success Systems International for mental and physical health. The sixth day was children and youth with Dr. Rian Eisler talking about the neuroscience behind children and youth today who dealing with and struggling with the themes of domination, trauma, and all the comorbid experiences of daily modern life. And then we had the theme of women with Andre Sheldon and Karen Palmer. And Andre, I don't know if you know Andre. He's a founder and director of the Global Strategy of Nonviolence. And he believes in the power of women to lead the movement towards nonviolence, which of course I agree with. Then we had human rights, and Dot Maver and her team led us on a discussion of the importance of water and its connections to all of the web of life. Then Jonathan Granoff, who I know that you know, Audrey, and he said I was asking big questions and looking for simple answers. And I said, well, yeah, maybe. But we came up with a plan in the end, and we decided it was all based on love. And then disarmament, which I told you about with Alan. So as I told yesterday in the conversation, that all of these things connect with disarmament and peace, and all of the themes overlap within and between. And so it was just a very wonderful experience for me. Who knew that I could talk? People who know me just think, really? She did this? But I did. And it's just been very meaningful. And Audrey, it's just wonderful to have you on our last day and to have Rick join us.
Well, thank you so much, Jana. And Rick, would I be able to just give a shout out to Global Silent Minute and on this International Day of Peace all the way around the world in every time zone at noon? There is an invocation from the Global Silent Minute that says, let the forces of light bring illumination to humankind. Let the spirit of peace be spread aboard. May men and women of goodwill everywhere meet in a spirit of cooperation. May forgiveness on the part of all be the keynote at this time, and let the power attend the efforts of the great ones. So let it be, and help us to do our part. And so it is. Om. Peace, peace, peace. Thank you so much.
May it be so.
Thank you.
Rick, may I end with a little poem that Robert, our resident poet,
sure.
wrote?
And then I have a little bit of, a shout out myself after you're done with the poem.
Okay, well, wonderful. I reached out to Robert Levine, who's also the editor of our Trans magazine, and I call him our poet in residence. Very short. The immensity of fear as the war machine pushes on, weapons of mass and massive destruction. The immensity of love, hope, the openness to life, to care, to dream, to create a transformed world of peace.
Thank you, Jana. And thank you, everyone. This has really been a truly amazing discussion and gathering. thank you all for participating in 11 Days of Global Unity 2022. I also wanted to do a shout out to Paul Slatkis and Good News Broadcast for producing an extraordinary annual celebration of the International Day of Peace right in Times Square, New York City. It's happening as we speak, and with We the World and other partners, broadcast by Unify on September 21st, the last day of 11 Days of Global Unity. So it's all about we, as you were saying earlier, as we've all been saying. So let's go from a me society to a we society. So together we can create a world that works for all. Go to we.net to get involved. Much love to all, and bye-bye.
Aloha. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.